Hello YouTube. So where I sail it quite often looks like this, or maybe like this. So the question that I get asked most often is, how do you keep warm, how do you stay alive, how do you actually not freeze to death inside the boat? So in this video I'm going to answer exactly that question. I'll go through the types of heating that I have on board. I have three types of heaters here actually. I have a forced air diesel heater, I have a reflex drip stove, and then I have some electric heating as well. I'll also go through some other types of heating that you can have for your boat, and most importantly I'll kind of list the advantages and disadvantages for each of those. Let's say that during these past 2 years that I've lived on board above the Arctic Circle, I've gathered some experience on these, so I can offer at least a somewhat educated opinion about these. This video is quite long, so I've placed timestamps down below if you want to skip ahead and if you only want to look at some certain sections. If you are only interested in the drip stove, then you can go and skip ahead to that section. One thing that I need to mention before we begin is that we are literally playing with fire here, so this is not meant to be like a complete installation video or an instructional video. It's just a video about how I do things here on board Sylvia, and kind of a video about advantages and disadvantages for each of these systems, especially if you leave aboard or if you plan to stay aboard for a longer amount of time. So the first heater that we are going to talk about is the forced air diesel heater, and it lives here in this stern cockpit locker. So this here is the actual heater from above, and let's take a side view. If you are not familiar with this, then this is actually how it works. So there's a separate diesel pump that feeds diesel into this, and the diesel line comes from somewhere there, and the diesel burns inside a burn chamber in here. The heater takes combustion air from here next to the exhaust. There's a combustion air inlet here, and the heating air inlet is here on the side. Can't really see it, but it's here. And basically the air gets heated up inside here, and then it gets forced out into this duct, and this duct goes into all of the cabins. And as you can see, the duct, I've insulated it with like 12 or 13 millimeters Armaflex. It's a closed cell foam, and it's approved for this kind of use. Now, some of the things that you want to keep in mind here is that this here, the exhaust, is going to get like super hot, and I actually haven't insulated it with anything because it's not really in danger of touching anything. These wires, they look like they are quite close, but they actually aren't, and they are quite well zip tied here. What you really need is a silencer for the exhaust, and if you buy one of the truck models or one of the cheaper models, then they are going to come with a really crappy silencer. And what I have here is actually a real marine silencer. It's a really long tube. I don't know, it might even be self-made by the previous owner, I am not completely sure, but it really silences this thing down, because these can be like really noisy otherwise. What's different in my installation compared to most is that I take the heating air, the air that gets heated and blown into the cabins, I take it from inside the locker. So I haven't got separate hose ducted into here, so you could use a hose and take the air that gets heated. You could take it from inside your cockpit or something. Basically you could use like outside air for it. I take the air from this locker because the air inside this locker is actually really fresh, like it doesn't smell or anything, but a lot of people have the problem that their lockers are smelly, so they can't take the air from inside the locker. What I do need to mention about that is that, of course, now you have the exhaust and the air inlet in the same space. So if something goes wrong with the exhaust, for example, if this hose breaks or starts leaking or something, then you are going to get the exhaust into your heating air, and it's going to get expelled into the cabins, and that's obviously really bad. But of course you want to have like a good CO2 detector inside the cabins anyway. I prefer to take the air from inside the locker because it actually keeps the air in this locker flowing, and it circulates the air inside here, and it's, well, this locker was fresh to begin with, but now it's going to be even more fresh. The combustion air I also take from inside the locker, and this is probably what most people do. There's no special need to take it from outside, unless your locker is like airtight. Alright, so here's one of the problems with the forced air diesel heaters, and it's also one that I'm experiencing, is that you normally don't have a good place to install the heater right next to the cabins or inside the cabins. So you end up installing it in the stern locker, which is where most people install it. And then you have a hose run of maybe a couple of meters before the warm air even reaches the cabins. And if you don't insulate this hose, then you're going to lose a lot of heat. So it's practically required or obligatory to insulate it, otherwise you are in trouble. This most commonly used air hose is like this cardboard type of hose, and that's also what I have. It was actually installed by the previous owner. But nowadays you can also get this thicker rubbery type of hose, which is kind of insulated to begin with, and it also doesn't break as easily. The cardboard hose is a little bit problematic because it's quite fragile, especially if you haven't insulated it. It kind of breaks quite easily, but insulating it does help because then the insulation is going to protect it a little bit. One more thing about the heater placement. When the old heater in this boat broke, I was thinking of maybe moving the heater and placing it maybe even inside the locker in the heads compartment, or maybe in this big cockpit locker here, so it would be closer to the cabins. The problem with that though is that then, well, you are going to have to run the exhaust hose out from somewhere, and I couldn't figure out a good place to run it out from. Basically, if you run it out from the side of the boat, it's getting in danger of getting submerged, and then also if you are at a dock, alongside a dock, then you are going to blow really hot air out from the side of your boat, and you have like fenders over there, or possibly even people, or maybe your dinghy or something like that if you're anchored. So the stern is usually the best place for the exhaust, unless you run it out from the cabin top or something. And I didn't want to make a long exhaust pipe run because I thought it would be like more dangerous in some ways, because if something happens to the exhaust hose, then it's like super hot air that would get expelled into the locker or something. Alright, so now we are back in the cabin, and before we talk about this bad boy over here, let's talk a little bit more about the forced air diesel heaters. So the air gets ducted into the cabins, and in each cabin there is like this outlet that you can adjust and you can close. The one in the main cabin, you cannot close that one. You always have to have one that cannot be closed, because if you accidentally close all of them, then the heater is going to overheat because it cannot push any of the warm air out. One of the things that often gets overlooked when people install and use these kind of heaters is the ducting. You have to be a little bit careful with that, because each of the heaters has like some kind of specification for the ducting. So the ducting has to be of certain diameter, and it can only be so and so long, and you can only have a certain amount of Y splits and so on. And if your ducting, if the diameter is too small, or you have too many splits, or you have too many curves in the ducting, then you get too much back pressure at the heater, and the heater is going to malfunction. So that's definitely something that you need to take care of, especially if you are changing heaters and installing a more powerful one. There are differences even within certain brands, so some Webasto heaters can do with smaller diameter ducting, and some of them need a bigger diameter ducting. The forced air heater that I have is actually a planar, or actually I think nowadays it's called Autotherm. It's a Russian brand, and the other more well-known brands are going to be Webasto and Espar or Eberspecher. In let's say in more of the Eastern European countries and also in Finland, the planar or Autotherm heaters are becoming quite common, and a lot of people think that they are approximately the same quality level as Webasto and Eberspecher, even though they are a little bit cheaper. I've had mine for 3 years now, and yeah, I haven't really done any maintenance on it or anything, and it works perfectly every time, so no complaints there. There are these Chinese diesel heaters on the market as well. They look the same as the higher quality ones, and I've been following the discussion concerning these Chinese heaters because they are like super cheap. You can buy one for like 100 or 150 bucks. But a lot of people have problems with them. They don't really work that well, and it's not something that I would personally install into my boat, even though I'm more of kind of the budget type of boater. It's just, I don't know, I think it's just too risky. It seems a little bit too risky to me. There are some other options as well for forced air diesel heaters. There are actually two brands of diesel heaters that come from Finland. They are called Vallas and Sapphire, and they are a little bit different compared to Eberspecher and Webasto and Planar. So the Espar and Webasto and Planar heaters, they all look the same and they all function the same way. Can't really tell if there's so many differences between them, but the Vallas and Sapphire heaters, they've been specifically made for boating and possibly for RV use. They are premium products in a way because they cost more. The price is going to be double or triple of a Webasto unit. They are less noisy and they use less electricity, but I don't really have much experience in those, so I'm not going to say much, but I'll just say that nowadays, like, they are regarded to be like the premium brand heaters in Finland. The Vallas heaters had a bit of a bad reputation, like the early ones from the 80s and 90s, they had a bad reputation, but the new ones are supposed to be really good. So if you have the funds, then that's maybe something that you might keep in mind as well. So to sum it up for the forced air diesel heaters really quickly, so the pros of them are definitely that you get like instant heat. You just push the button on the control panel and 2 minutes later they will be pushing out lots of warm air. They are also easily regulated. You can have thermostats or whatever, and it's kind of like a modern solution. You just push a button and it works, at least hopefully. They distribute the heat very well between the different cabins if you have outlets in each cabin, and they produce a lot of dry air. Like, your boat is going to be so dry inside when you use one of these. One minor pro as well for real winter sailing that I've noticed is that I can use the planar to heat pretty much any compartment or locker in my boat, because the warm air ducting comes through the lockers, so I can actually disconnect the ducting at the heater itself to warm up the stern locker, and that's actually quite useful for me because the bilge pump hoses go through that locker and they freeze in the winter. So if I want to unfreeze them, then I just disconnect the ducting hose and I run the heater, and it's going to unfreeze the hoses and it's going to warm up the stern locker. So theoretically I could have the same kind of system for, say, example, for the engine compartment as well. If I had an engine that has trouble starting up in the cold, I could warm up the engine compartment with my forced air diesel heater, but I don't need to do that at the moment. That's just a small minor thing. Then the cons of this kind of system is that the forced air diesel heaters, I find them to be like quite complex. There's lots of wires and wiring and, you know, diesel coming from the main tank, or you have a separate tank and you have to have the air ducting, and the ducting takes up really a lot of space. That's actually a major minus. Like running the ducting, if you don't have the holes already running that through the bulkheads, it's going to be a major job and it's going to take a lot of space inside the lockers. The complexity of these things is such that you can do some maintenance on them yourself to some extent, but if the electronics break down, then there's no way that I would personally repair one of those, especially on the field. You know, say I'm sailing here somewhere and I'm anchored somewhere, and if I had to try and repair one of those, it probably wouldn't happen. So that's the thing that I don't like about them. And the other major thing is that they use a lot of electricity. So when they are starting up and there's the glow plugs and they are heating up the diesel, I think it uses about 10 amps for a while, and then it's going to use about 1 or 2 amps per hour when running. So that really adds up when you're anchored somewhere in the winter and you don't really have a good source for electricity, that you are not going to have any solar power or anything. So that's a major minus for me. One minor con is also the possible carbon buildup inside the heater. So if you're running these things on very low settings, then they are going to produce soot, and eventually it will clog up the heater. So I haven't had any problems because I regularly run mine on the highest setting. I pretty much, most of the time when I use these things, I run them at the highest setting. A lot of people don't do that, and then the heater will clog up and you have to take it apart and clean it. So one thing that you definitely shouldn't do when buying one of these is that you can't oversize them. So if you think that you probably only need 2 kilowatts, but you might occasionally use 4 kilowatts, then it's probably better to buy the smaller heater. Go for the 2 kilowatt heater and just use it at full blast most of the time. Let's go on to the second type of heater that I have here, and it's this reflex stove, and it's what I mostly use. It's a diesel stove. It's a very simple one. So how it works is that it gets gravity fed diesel from this small tank over here, and the tank is filled from the deck. There is a deck fill, and there is also an emergency shut-off valve here. So the diesel line goes down to the regulator, and the regulator is used to adjust the amount of diesel that goes inside the burn chamber. And the regulator is just a set of like mechanical things. There are like some springs, and there's kind of like a float switch inside. You can open it up and it looks kind of like something that you might be able to fix if it broke down. And there is also a filter that is quite easy to clean. So it's a mechanical regulator, it doesn't require any electricity. And yeah, then after that the diesel goes inside the burn chamber, and you basically light it up, and then the diesel starts burning and it produces heat. Now this thing has a bit of a learning curve, so you need to learn how to use it. It takes some practice to learn the best ways to light it up and how to actually use it for heating. But once you learn how to do it, then it burns with like really nice clean blue flame. It burns really cleanly and produces almost no soot at all. I'm just going to show you the flame now. I'll open the cooktop with this high-tech device here, and it's quite windy outside. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but that means that once I open this, it's going to immediately distract the draft, and the flame, it will be like blue first, but it will turn yellow very, very soon. So let's have a look. See the blue flame with just yellow tops and the red glowing thingy, and now the airflow got distracted and it's going to turn kind of yellow and a little bit smoky, and this is what you don't want to see, something like this. It has to be blue and burning nice and cleanly. So I'll close it up again. And you can hear how it kind of picks up the draft, and it really burns nice and well. So this is the chimney for the reflex diesel heater, and it's a removable one, so you can just take this thing off, and then you can take off the next section as well, and you can replace that with a cap. And that's what I do when I go sailing, because otherwise the Genoa sheet is going to get wrapped around here at some point and it's going to destroy the whole thing. So you could theoretically build like a structure here to protect this thing, and that's what I kind of wanted to do when I was leaving Finland, but I didn't have time to do that. And it turns out that this solution is actually pretty good for me, because if I need heating when I'm sailing or motoring, then I just use the forced air diesel heater instead. The thing is here that there is some soot here. You can see that even though the flame burns really cleanly, there is going to be some black stuff coming out a little bit, and you can see the deck here is a little bit dirty. And that's one thing that makes this unsuitable for you if you want to have like really shiny and really white clean decks all the time. One more thing about the chimney is that it has to be tall enough. I think mine is now a little bit over 2 meters overall, and it could be even taller. The chimney cap that I have here is the H style cap, which is kind of considered to be the best one, and it's what all the fishermen here use. But if I were to choose again, I might also try the yacht style cap, because the problem with this one is the soot. So when it rains, the rain is gonna go through here and then come out of here and gather all of the soot, and it's gonna end up on the deck. And even though it's not much, it's still a little bit. And the yacht style cap, it has like kind of this rain protection thing cap, and well, it might or might not work. I heard that this is the best one to use when it's like really windy, because it effectively completely stops like the backdraft, and I've been really happy with it so far. The stove actually has a double skin, so it doesn't get hot to touch, even though it's now running at almost full power, because I wanted to show you the flame, and I can still touch the stove here, and I can even touch it here. I can even touch the cover for the chimney. The chimney itself gets super hot, so you don't want to touch that, but you don't want to have an insulated chimney inside the boat either, because the chimney radiates a lot of heat, and if it was insulated you would lose a lot of heat. So these things come with a water coil as well, so you can plug in like radiators. So then there would be a water coil inside the burn chamber, and then you could run the water lines throughout your boat and install some radiators. I chose not to do that because I thought my boat is a little bit too small for that. I didn't want to add to the complexity either. I wanted to have like as simple installation as possible, but that's definitely an option as well, and I know some people who have done that very successfully. What I use to distribute the heat as well as possible instead are these thermoelectric fans here. And these are just like quite cheap fans that I bought from a random hardware store from Claes Olsson, actually, if you are familiar with that, if you live in Scandinavia. How they work is by temperature difference. So there is a Peltier element there, like this thing. You might see a little bit of white in there, and so there's a temperature difference between this base plate and this area with the kind of the cooling fins, and that produces electricity, and then there's a wire that goes into the small electric motors in the fans, and then when this thing gets hot, the fans automatically start spinning. Normally you would use them here on the cooktop, but I chose to install them to the chimney, so I just attach them with like these really big hose clamps. And the good thing about that is of course that you can still use the cooktop, and the other good thing is that I don't have to worry about like taking the fan off. It's kind of permanently mounted, or they are kind of permanently mounted right now, and they are really well mounted as well, so they won't be going anywhere when I'm sailing. Especially the one at the ceiling is really useful because obviously all the warm air will rise to the ceiling, and it actually gets like quite hot up there, and so the fan there is going to blow the air out and distribute it a little bit better. So the good things about this is that it's a super simple design, of course. It's not much that can break here. It's pretty much just a regulator that could break. I mean, you could theoretically carry a spare regulator. It's a couple $100 or maybe $300 for one, and it does provide kind of more nice and cozy, homely feeling compared to the forced air diesel heater, because this thing radiates the heat mostly, so the heat is kind of, it feels nicer, right? It still does dry up the boat very well. Of course you need to have some ventilation, but it's a very dry boat when you have this one running like through the whole day. And one thing that I really like as well is the cooktop, so effectively it works as a spare cooktop if your propane stove went haywire, and you would at least have something to cook things on. This is not like a place where you want to start any kind of gourmet, like really fine dishes, but I do warm up like water here and make some simple soups and stuff like that, so then you kind of, it's kind of free heat you save up on the propane a little bit. Then if you choose to install the heating coil for the radiators, the good thing about that compared to the forced air diesel heater is that the water lines or the lines for the radiators are going to be much easier to run than the ducting for the forced air diesel heater, because those are going to be just very small diameter hoses or copper pipe. One more positive thing about this thing is that it's quite easy to install if you have a good place for it. So I just took out part of the settee here. The settee here was kind of useless anyway because there's a mast support here. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's kind of in the way, so it's like kind of really hard for anyone to get in there to sit there anyway. So the place, it was pretty much useless, so I just took that out, and then there was a flat place to install this, and then you just need to drill a hole in the ceiling and put a diesel tank somewhere, and you are pretty much done. So I think that was probably less work than installing the forced air diesel heater. So the bad things, apart from the learning curve to learn how to use it, one of them is that this thing does produce soot, like I mentioned earlier. Even though the flame burns really cleanly, it still produces a little bit of soot, and your deck is going to get a little bit of soot on it. The chimney placement is one of the biggest problems, especially in sailboats. So in most of the boats, medium-sized boats, the stove is going to be installed in this spot. That's where you see it most often in sailboats. That's because it's kind of the most sensible place. It does take a little bit longer time to heat up the cabin using this one, so it takes a bit of time before the flame starts burning cleanly. I mean, the burn chamber has to warm up first, and then after that the flame starts burning cleanly, and even after that it still needs to radiate the heat out, so it takes a little bit more time to warm up the boat compared to the forced air diesel heater. So I might make a more detailed video about how to use this one in the future, but I'm not going to describe it in detail right now because this video would just become like way too long. But what I want to do though is kind of compare the efficiency between these two systems, the forced air diesel heater and this one, and that was one of my biggest questions when I installed this reflex stove here. And I found out that the efficiency, it's about the same, right? So per liter of diesel burnt, I think I get the same amount of heat out of it. And I think that's actually quite logical, because if the diesel burns cleanly, then it's always going to produce the same amount of heat. And I think that this applies to all of the heaters, pretty much all of the diesel heaters. All of the modern diesel heaters, they burn cleanly, or at least as long as they burn cleanly, they are going to produce the same amount of heat per liter burned. The differences probably come from things like, you know, the ducting. If your ducting for the forced air diesel heater is crappy, if it's not insulated, then you're going to lose a lot of heat there. And for this one, of course, you lose some heat through the chimney. I think you probably lose more heat here through the chimney than you lose through the exhaust of the forced air diesel heater. But this one, then, it doesn't have any ducting, so it doesn't lose any heat through the ducting. My forced air diesel heater, although it's very well insulated, the ducting, it's still going to lose some heat there. So the conclusion, kind of what I found out, is that if I'm here alone in the winter, and if I'm here alone in the winter, then I'm going to be living here in the main cabin. I'm gonna sleep on the kind of the pilot berth there, and then it's going to take the same amount of diesel to keep the boat warm. Doesn't really matter which one of these heaters you use. The thing is that the planar, the forced air diesel heater, it uses so much electricity that I can't use it when I'm anchored. So I just use the reflex most of the time, and I use the planar when I'm motoring or sailing, or when I come into an anchorage and I'm like really damn cold and I just want to get the boat warmed up really quickly. That's when I use the planar. But most of the time I use this one here. Alright, so the final and last heater that I have here on board is this electric heater. Actually, I have a few of these on board, different kinds of these. And they might seem really simple, but there are a few misconceptions about these on the internet. So let me clear this up really quickly for any of you that might be wondering about these. So of course I only use these when I'm in a harbor and I have electricity from the harbor, so when I have shore power. And some harbors will let you use this and some will not. And actually here in Norway it's just slightly cheaper to run diesel heating compared to electric heating, because electricity here is quite expensive. Of course diesel is quite expensive as well, but I still use electric heating when I'm connected to shore power, if I'm allowed to, because it's quite a bit more ecological than burning diesel. So one thing that people talk about when they use electric heaters inside their boat is like, how efficient are they? They are like comparing different kinds of electric heaters and they're going like, oh, this one is more efficient than the other one. But the thing about electric heaters though is that they are all 100% efficient. So if you put 800 watts of power into this through this power cord, then it's going to produce 800 watts of heat. So it doesn't really matter actually which one you use. The only differences here are like how much noise they are going to make and then how well they distribute the heat. So that's why I have these small ones, because they have a fan and they distribute the heat very well. They are quite noisy though. But I also had like this oil-filled radiator, and I thought, yeah, I'll have a few oil-filled radiators because they are completely quiet, but they don't distribute the heat so well. So personally I prefer these small ones because I don't use them that often, and these can be stored really easily and they last pretty much forever. And yeah, they distribute the heat pretty well, and I can also put, if I'm sitting somewhere and it's really cold, I can put it there where I'm actually sitting. But let's put this one away for now and talk about some of the heating options that I currently don't have aboard Sylvia, and I'm not currently using those, and why I'm not using those. First of all is LPG, or propane and butane, and what some people have are like these standalone propane heaters that they just kind of put inside the boat. And the problem with those is that when you burn LPG, it produces a lot of moisture, and then you get a lot of condensation inside the boat, and you can kind of get by that problem if you really ventilate the boat really well. But I think that's not really a long-term solution, at least not for me. There are kind of stoves, propane stoves, that you could use as well. So they have a chimney, and that's why they don't produce any moisture, so they produce dry heat. But the problem there is that you are going to need a lot of propane or butane to produce a lot of heat. So if you are running it 24/7, then you're going to need a lot of propane. I have some numbers here that I wrote down when I was kind of researching this, and I found out that 11 kilograms of butane, and 11 kilograms is the size of the big gas bottle here in Europe. It has a heat content of about like 170 kilowatt hours. So if I use around 30 kilowatt hours per day, which is what I'm using at the moment, so I'm using around 4 or 5 liters of diesel per day, I would use 1 bottle of LPG every 6 or 7 days, and that's just like unacceptable for me. Like, it's just not going to work, because I would need to change bottles all the time, and the bottles are also quite expensive. I can't remember now, but I think I calculated that it would be at least 3 times more expensive to use propane than to use diesel. So that's that for me. I think that's something that you might use in a pinch, or if you are not using it like 24/7, then that's definitely an option for you. Then there are systems that take advantage of the engine cooling system. So basically you extend the cooling system so that the lines run outside the engine, and then there's a radiator or there's a fan that blows the warm air into the cabin. And that's something that I probably should have on Sylvia, because that's basically like free heat. So when you are motoring, you could basically warm up the cabin for free, because the engine is going to radiate that heat anyway. But I don't have it at the moment. I might try to install one of those in the future. Alright guys, so that was a lot of talking, and I haven't done that much talking in ages. So it was a very tough experience, but if you found it at least remotely useful, then please leave me a comment, and please also do leave me a comment if you are interested in watching a video that describes the reflex heater in a little bit more detail, and especially like how to use it and so on. Other than that, it's just the usual stuff. I hope to see you next time, and please remember to subscribe as well. Bye bye.